Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast, powered by Advanced Takedown Tree Stands, episode number 194. Scott Shawl, the high-pressured buck puzzle. Please support our sponsors as they make this show possible. Today's show is sponsored by Advanced Takedown Tree Stands, Covert Scouting Cameras, the Euro Hanger, and Morse's Sporting Goods. Big Buck Registry is a virtual museum of hunting stories. We preserve a piece of Americana by interviewing and recording hunters about their hunts and experiences from across the country. And who knows, maybe we'll learn a thing or two along the way that'll help us take our hunt to the next level.
This is Big Al Morris with Fox Pro Game Calls, and you're listening to my favorite deer hunting podcast, Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast.
Hi, this is Dan Infalt from HuntingBeast.com. You're about to listen to one of my favorite podcasts, Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast.
This is Matt Light, former New England Patriot, and you're listening to my favorite podcast, the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast.
Hey everybody, Dusty Phillips from the Big Buck Registry. I'm joined here with Jay Scott. Jay, what's happening in New Hampshire, brother?
Hey man, just hanging out here in the studio. It's, finally the third round of snow has disappeared.
That's been brutal on you guys in New Hampshire this year. Snow, more snow. Then it cleared up for a little bit. Now there's more snow. I hope everybody out there listening is like in Florida and it's 85 degrees so that you can kind of bust on Jay a little bit with the snow.
Yeah, appreciate it.
We got a cold spell coming in this weekend here, and today I think it's supposed to be 50 degrees and low of 30s last night on Friday night. But man, I tell you, we got 70 degrees coming on Monday. Things are greening up and trees are blooming. If the cold weather doesn't kill them, we'll have, I think spring's going to officially launch off Monday morning.
I want to go chase some longbeards, man.
I hear you. It's not far away, and I did see a couple posts where I'm starting to see some bucks get a few small knots on their head where them antlers are starting to come back.
I'm hoping that we can start capturing some photographs on our new covert scouting cameras.
Yeah, I can't wait. If you don't know, you know now. DLCcovert.com. Covert Scouting Cameras have teamed up with us for the 2017. They're here all year.
I'm so psyched that those guys joined on with us. Genuinely feel really excited that we're working with them.
Their warranty is like no other, and their customer service is really good. So, Jay, I think it's going to be a great partner for us.
I've run tests on the same tree, one on top of the other, with a variety of cameras. Different brands, different manufacturers, and the one that had the best trigger speed with the best cameras and the best video, hands down, each and every time, was the Covert.
It doesn't get no better than that. And if you guys do decide to buy a Covert scouting camera, let them know the Big Buck Registry sent you over to make that purchase. We do appreciate that.
What are you thinking about the live stuff we've been doing?
I've been enjoying it, Jay, and I think we're going to do more and more of that. You know, if you get a chance, it's been happening on Thursdays, and what's really unique about it is if you got a question or a comment, you can post it up right there, and we've been doing pretty good about getting through all the questions, comments, and getting people interacting with our guests. It's real neat.
If you could, I'd like to hear some feedback if you're listening to the show. Jay@bigbuckregistry.com, just entitle your email live feed. I'd like to hear some feedback on that.
Absolutely, and we still got the harness program going on. If you got a safety harness and you would like to donate it to us, shoot me an email, Dusty@BigBuckRegistry, or Jay an email, Jay@BigBuckRegistry.com. Shoot us an email, and we'll gladly get you our address, and you can ship the safety harnesses out to us, or we can forward an address, and if you wouldn't mind shipping it right out to the person that needs it.
Dusty, this week I had the pleasure of speaking to a fellow by the name of Fred Bird. He came into the studio up here in New Hampshire, and we shot a video that talked about a couple of events coming up for the NWTF. Yeah, let me play a little clip for you from Fred.
I grew up in southern New Hampshire. I was in the military for a number of years in the late 90s, early 2000s. And
nice, man.
I actually went to southeastern Ohio and cut my teeth hunting there.
Oh, really?
And then I came back to New Hampshire and said, well, this isn't hunting. I got to go back to southeastern Ohio, at least whitetail-wise. But no, I've been here since I got out of the military in 2005, and
nice.
Here I am.
Nice. How do you like the studios, Big Buck Studios?
It's 5-star. I didn't expect it, and it's wonderful.
The water's cold.
The water is cold, yes.
Yes, it is. So tell me about some of the events that we've got coming up for the NWTF. I mean, I've gone to several NWTF events. I've purchased many of product or won some of the silent raffles and things like that. And tell me about the two events that are coming up here at the end of April.
End of April 22nd, we have our Southern Maine Strutters Hunting Heritage Banquet. That's going to be in Elliott at the Regatta over there in Maine. And it's going to be a big event. It's their second year, and they're on the precipice of doing something pretty special, not just for Maine, but for all of New England. It's really exciting times in Maine. So this is a great group of volunteers they're young, they're eager, and they are just extremely fired up about our mission with the National Wild Turkey Federation, conserving the wild turkey and preserving our hunting heritage.
Right. Gotcha. And there's something else going on in New Hampshire down at Bass Pro.
That's right. The next Saturday, if you can't make it on the 22nd, you come out and see us after you take a youth out in the morning, 3 o'clock at Bass Pro Shops in Hooksett. Our Capital Region Strutters are going to have their big fundraising event.
Nice. That event is going to be in the back room down at the Bass Pro Shops. Now, I've never been in the back room. How do you get there?
The great room.
The great room, right.
If you know where the gun counter is, it's the other side of the wall.
Well, what can we expect at this banquet?
It'd be cliche to say a good time, but a good time where there's going to be, like you said, first-timers to an NWTF banquet are always wide-eyed and very shocked by the presentation that we put on. And, you know, the items, everything from furniture and beautiful artwork to the great amount of guns. This event, these two events in particular, are going to have great opportunities to walk out with quite a few guns. There's going to be a lot there, which is fun.
How many guns we have on the docket?
At Carter's, I think we're between 20 to 30, and same over in Southern Maine.
Okay.
So there's going to be a lot of guns, and we're going to have a couple of guests there as well. Locally here in New England and the Northeast, a lot of people know Hal Blood.
Yeah.
He's coming down from the big woods of Maine and Jackman, and he's going to be a guest of ours and talk a little turkey as well.
You may not know this unless you've been going through our back catalog, but Hal Blood was a guest on the show not too long ago.
That's right.
He's a good representation of what it's like to hunt in New England.
That's right. Just a few hours before I came over here, I was scratching my box, getting 5 of them fired up in the backyard. I can't hunt them right there in my neighborhood, so I get to play with those birds. They're out there doing their thing.
Right.
Snowpack's going down, so they're able to start strutting, obviously, a little bit more.
I like watching the big boys try to walk on soft snow. It's funny.
It's wonderful.
You know, my son was fortunate enough to take his first longbeard last year.
That's awesome.
One of the best experiences I think we've ever had. And it wasn't during youth, actually. Mm-hmm. It was after. How do you get more people into it?
You know, it's like you're saying, it's one of those things you can talk about it till you're blue in the face to your buddies, but once you experience it, that's when you feel that adrenaline spike in your hearts and your throat you can't swallow. We have some great mentor programs locally here in New Hampshire. We did our second year mentor programs, and actually we were very pleased to team up with a local radio station here in New Hampshire. This past November, they do a canned food drive, which actually turned to a 2-day fundraiser, radiothon. Something I had wanted to contribute for years before I was even working for the Turkey Federation. How could I give back to that? Because the money they raise goes to 11 food agencies locally here. And so obviously once I had this opportunity, one of the radio personalities is a hunter and never had been turkey hunting. I said, wow, what a cool opportunity to promote our mentorship program.
Right.
And so I presented it to him, got a lot of our great partners and sponsors to kick in. Nomad Outdoor, they're brand new partners of ours for this year. Clucky's Outdoors, who Carter's associated with, they're filming. Fishing Game is filming. Got a Gun. Bass Pro gave them a shopping spree. We did that, and that turned into from that to our first all-women's mentor program.
Wow.
So they went through the program, Turkey 101.
Yep.
Some of them already patterned. The rest of them are going to pattern when the weather gets better, and then that first weekend, they're all going to go try to kill birds.
That's awesome.
Our volunteers are a great resource in the community, so that if you have a kid, or you're in that 20 to 40-year-old range, and it's something dad or grandpa didn't raise you on, but it's something you want to do, right? You want to take advantage of a green movement and feed yourself off the land. That's great. Our volunteers can take you out, and they're happy to do it. They want to, that's part of our Save the Habitat, Save the Hunt initiative. We're trying to create 1.5 million hunters.
Cool, man. I appreciate you coming on the show and telling us about the NWTF. And one more time, tell us about the two events that are coming up.
April 22nd in Elliott, Maine at the Regatta, Southern Maine Strutters, and April 29th, Bass Pro Shops in Hooksett, New Hampshire, Capital Region Strutters.
Very cool. Very, very cool.
Thank you for having me on.
Thanks, Fred. Appreciate it.
Thanks, sir.
Nice talking to Fred Bird, and thank you for the information about the upcoming events. And Dusty, this week's guest is Scott Shawl, and I don't know if you know who he is, but he's a guy out of Michigan, and he hunts the swamps a lot like Sam Ubel does and a lot like Dan Infalt does. And I couldn't help but find the similarities in a lot of the hunting styles. And turns out that Scott was actually recommended to us from Dan Infalt. Because a lot of times I will ask some of our guests, so who do you think we should have on the show? And Scott was very responsive in our request, and he came and he said, yeah, definitely would like to join you. And turns out that he credits Dan for some aspects of his hunting where he was pretty successful overall, but then Dan really pushed the issue where you have to get even closer to the buck beds in the swamps than he was getting, and that actually turned out really well for him, and he saw more success doing it that way than he did just not getting as close as he was. So he credits Dan for some of that stuff. I tell you, we had one heck of a in-depth conversation. Let's turn over to Jim Keller with the deer news.
The deer news this week is sponsored by the Euro Hanger. You don't have to spend big bucks to hang your big buck. Get yourself a Euro Hanger. Facebook.com/Eurohanger, EUROHANGER.
For the Big Buck Registry, this is Jim Keller with the Deer News. Our first story this week, morel mushroom hunters. Beware of an increase in Lyme disease carrying ticks this spring. This story was originally featured on the OutdoorHub.com website. In the same breath of warning, spring hunters about the grim Lyme disease forecast were also warning morel mushroom hunters to be aware of an increase in Lyme in 2017. In 2016, a plague of mice struck down on the Hudson River Valley. This little creature is a big nuisance, and for morel mushroom hunters, this means one thing: more ticks. Rick Osfeld, an ecologist at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies in Millbrook, New York, and his wife Felicia Keesing, an ecologist at Bard College, say the rise in mice for 2016 correlates to the Lyme disease cases the following summer. Keesing and Osfield have studied Lyme disease for over 20 years and have come up with a way to predict when the disease will be more prominent. Count the mice the year before, they reported. It's quite simple, really. Mice provide free rides for all ticks all summer long, and mice are responsible for infecting up to 95% of the ticks feeding on them with Lyme. An individual mouse might have 56 or even 100 ticks covering its ears and face, Osfield said. If you're going to be doing any morel mushroom hunting this spring, you're going to want to pay extra close attention when checking for ticks. Osfield is predicting 2017 to be a particularly risky year, the highest risk. Regardless, morel hunters and all other folks spending time outdoors this summer should be vigilant in checking for the pesky insect. Should Alaska's refuges be open for hunting again? Sprawling over 77 million acres, Alaska's 16 national wildlife refuges are peppered with iconic animals from grizzly bears and black bears to wolves and coyotes. But these predators, which have enjoyed increased protection since this past summer, could once again be hunted using controversial methods such as trapping and baiting. A measure passed by the U.S. Senate on Tuesday would abolish a U.S. Fish and Wildlife rule enacted in August that largely banned hunting in Alaska's wildlife refuges, which stretch from the remote Arctic in the north to the Aleutian Islands extending far to the west. The resolution previously cleared the House of Representatives and now needs only President Donald Trump's signature to become law. The Obama-era rule specifically prohibits hunting for predator control, which refers to killing predators in order to protect another species. Wolves, coyotes, and other meat eaters feed on ungulates such as deer and moose, which many Alaskans rely on for food. In making its rule, Fish and Wildlife Service argued that Alaska law had erred in prioritizing the populations of these ungulates by allowing hunters to kill too many of the predators. Oklahoma may legalize hog hunting from helicopters. This story was originally featured on the OutdoorNews.com website. Oklahoma could soon join Louisiana and Texas in allowing hunters to shoot feral hogs from helicopters. The Tulsa World reports that aerial gunners are already used to help control feral swine in Oklahoma, but that work can only be done by trained licensed contractors with support from the Oklahoma Department of Agricultural, Food, and Forestry. Lawmakers are considering a bill to expand the law to private operations. Under the proposal, private landowners, companies, and pilots would have to apply for a state license and be responsible for the activity. But hunters on board the aircraft wouldn't need a license, nor would they have to provide their names to the state. The Agriculture Department says its agents killed more than 11,200 feral hogs, mostly by air, last year. That concludes this week's edition of the Big Buck Registry's Deer News. For links to the stories featured this week, please check our show notes at www.bigbuckregistry.com. If you have any ideas for future topics or have questions about any of these topics, please email me at jim@bigbuckregistry.com. For the Big Buck Registry, this is Jim Keller with the Deer News.
Thanks to Jim Keller with the Deer News. Without further ado, here's Scott Shawl.
Scott Shawl, welcome to the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast. How are you, my friend?
Doing very well. Thanks, Jay. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's, springtime is starting to look like springtime in New England, and despite there still being a massive amount of snow covering the ground. So
it
hasn't been a rough winter per se, but it's come and gone 3 times.
Yeah, I think that's pretty similar here in Michigan. We're down to dry ground, but I've got a big winter storm blowing in tonight where we may get 8 to 10 inches of snow, so kind of hit or miss for us as well.
It's been a weird winter, man. Really weird.
It has.
Yeah. Tell me more about where you live.
I'm in the lower peninsula of Michigan is where I live. As you know, it's shaped like the left hand of a mitten, and I'm pretty much right about in the center of that mitten, not far from there.
Gotcha. What's life like there?
It's a great place to live, very community-oriented. The deer hunting culture is incredible in this area. It's probably as strong as anywhere you'll come across. You know, the school's closed for the first 2 days of the gun deer season here all through my youth. If they didn't close the schools, there weren't any people in the school. So a very strong culture. You know, it seems like every man, woman, and child deer hunts. So I was pretty fortunate as far as that goes to grow up in this area. When I was a youth, I had teachers all through school that were avid deer hunters, and so they taught they were the hunter safety instructors, and we would just stay after school, my friends and I, and take the hunter safety classes right in the classroom after school. And then the school owned what they called the school farm, and it was actually a very large tract of woods where we did the actual hands-on safety and learning how to shoot safely. And so that was a strong avenue of getting into deer hunting as well, that I was able to spend this time hunting with my teachers who, you know, I looked up to as a youth.
That's awesome. So there, and I always love hearing stories about this culture where they actually, you know, cancel schools so everybody can go deer hunting.
Right.
It's not something I was able to experience when I was growing up, although we skipped school, but it wasn't like a planned cancellation. Right. So tell me about that whole concept. How does that actually play out? How do you is it on the school calendar, the days that you can plan ahead?
Yeah, they didn't actually say deer hunting, but everyone knew what it was for. So we always open up in gun deer season on November 15th. We have for countless decades. So the 15th and the 16th, if that fell during weekdays, we were off, and everyone knew what it was for.
That's amazing. And this was, how far does that span in Michigan? Is that a Michigan thing, or is that
in the big cities? Yeah, in the big cities, not so much. You know, the kids just wouldn't show up that were deer hunters. But in small town Michigan, it wasn't uncommon to have that.
Gotcha. Very, very cool. Hunting has been part of your youth. It sounds like this is something that goes back a ways. And
from a very young age, and then also, Jay, I've got, we've been deer hunting here in Michigan, my family, for over 175 years now. So between the school thing, my teachers, and my family traditions, that's kind of how I was brought into it.
175 years of deer hunting as part of a family tradition. Wow. Yes. All right, can we go back 175 years? Do you have stories from back then?
Well, in the 1840s is the first that I see that had family here that deer hunted in Michigan. Some of the stories back then, you know, the game laws existed. I'm sure that things were very different in that there weren't a lot of law enforcement, and the limits probably weren't strictly enforced and that sort of a thing. But everyone in my family deer hunted, and in fact, it became a way of life for them. When they first came into Michigan, my family moved up to a very large island called Drummond Island, which is also known by the Indians as the Gem of the Huron. It's about 250 square miles, 87,000 acres. And then my family managed to purchase half a dozen of the islands off the north shore of Drummond Island, which is just off of the eastern upper peninsula. So real strong tradition. There was no Mackinac Bridge or anything like that back then, but commercial fishing. moving mail by boat from Sheboygan, Michigan, over to Drummond Island and the islands that my family owned. That's how they made their living. And, deer hunting was an important part of their food source back then. So they actually built a hand-built ship called the Effie, and that was their commercial fishing vessel, and how we moved freight and mail from mainland Michigan out to Shawl Island, named after my family, and out to Drummond Island.
No kidding. That's fantastic. So this is going back to the 1840s.
Correct.
Do you have the names of some of your ancestors that were living off the land in that format and living off of the water?
Sure. We had a George, a Leo, some fairly common names, nothing really all that unusual, yeah.
All of the Shawl variety.
Correct.
Gotcha. Wow, that's awesome. So 175 years, so that's the 1840s. And how does that progress over the years? And I don't know if there's been stories that have been shared throughout. Yeah,
there has. As I said, the commercial fishing back then was relatively not that common in the Great Lakes. And so my family's operation became quite large. They had a lot of employees that lived on the islands that worked for the fishery. And then over here on mainland Michigan, they employed drivers and delivered the fish that my family got in northern Lake Huron to markets in Chicago and Grand Rapids and areas like that.
Gotcha. Wow. That's a lot of years to pass along to deer hunting. So you must have been like a great deer hunter by age 5 with all that great knowledge of deer hunting in Michigan.
Well, my family's pretty laid back and easygoing, so they weren't too worried about it, but we did have all of that tradition. The first time that I ever deer hunted, I was 12. Got a bear recurve bow for my birthday that year.
Sure. I think everybody did. That was 40 years plus. I think everybody had a bear bow back then.
You had to, pretty much.
Right.
And so I practiced with that a lot. And the first deer hunting I did, you couldn't bow hunt in Michigan until you were 12 years of age.
Right.
So by the time deer season rolled around, I was pretty proficient. I didn't just had a little flipper rest on the bow. I didn't have a bow sight or anything like that. And spent a lot of time practicing. And then my father was friends with the neighborhood farmer who lived about a mile down the road. And I think they got a big kick out of it when I had to go ask for permission to hunt the property. It was one of those wink things between my dad and the farmer.
Right.
I really don't think they thought I was going to be successful, but I had a pretty good setup. The property and the farm that I was hunting, there was a very large thicket where all the bucks and does bedded. That was fronted by very mature white and red oak trees, and then it was backed by a standing cornfield. There was no one bow hunting it at all, so I pretty much had the place to myself. No tree stand, no tree steps, no ladders, anything like that. So what I had to do is I got into those mature oaks that were in front of that thicket with the cornfield behind it, and there was a low-hanging limb on a very large white oak, and I had to run at it as fast as I could run and jump as high as I could jump. Again, I was age 12. Caught that lower limb, swung my feet up over it, swung myself back up on the limb, and started jumping limb to limb up into the tree and pulled that bear bow up. So then, I don't think anyone really thought that I was going to be successful, but it worked out perfectly. Deer came out of the thicket into those oaks. Buck went behind one of the large oak trees, and I drew back on the recurve, and we stepped out on the other side, center punched him. And I learned a lesson with that buck because I was so excited. I jumped about 15 feet out of the tree to go home and brag.
Yeah.
And I didn't really watch where the buck went. So I ran across the field, got on the bicycle, and sped about a mile home. Went through the front door, and the look on my father's face when I yelled that I just shot a buck, I don't really think he saw that coming, and I wish I could have had it on videotape. But so the quick lesson learned, for a youth hunter is that you do need to watch where the buck goes after you shoot it. My dad was a very experienced hunter and quickly tracked the buck down, and we recovered it. But that was the first buck that I'd ever taken. I was about 12 years old, was the earliest that I could bow hunt.
Parents never really expect much to happen when you first go out in the woods. And certainly my dad didn't do that with me, and we went out, but I guarantee you that he was, winking at my grandfather, not expecting to see a deer, not once.
Right.
It was more of an educational situation, a teaching moment for them
I think that's a good point. Yeah,
it was a teaching moment to handle firearms safely, to walk in the woods, to understand the tracks of the deer and the droppings, and if we were lucky enough to find a scrape or a rub, point that out. But that was about it. Never once did we ever see a deer when we were hunting, and I never really took it all that seriously because they like to go. My dad was an avid outdoorsman, but not an avid hunter. He loved being outside. He loved shooting with guns and stuff.
Sure. Yeah. I think my situation was similar, although my brother and I, we had such a lengthy, strong tradition that getting into our gun deer camp, we had a traditional family gun deer camp in northern Michigan at our cabin, grandfathers, father, uncles, cousins. That was really our goal, was to be accepted into that group. And that was a very strong goal for my brother and I. So that's something that we worked towards from an early age when we started bow hunting there. And then trying to get that acceptance to be able to be turned loose on our own at our traditional family deer hunting camp up north was very important to us.
Gotcha. My mom was not an anti, but certainly was someone that approved of hunting in any way, shape, or form. So there was always this antithesis type of thing going on in my household. My dad wanted to go and take his boys out. My mom was just frowning upon it the whole time. And here's why. My grandfather shot a deer when my mom was 8 years old, and hung it in his basement and failed to tell my mom that it was hanging there. So she went down into the basement to fetch something and bumped into the carcass of the deer hanging in the basement. And from that point on, she was a borderline anti-hunter from then on.
That's hilarious. I certainly can't blame her for that.
Right.
That would definitely scare someone, no doubt about it.
I think it would, but it also paints a very important point, which is to give kids positive experiences across the board, not only in the field but off the field. And if you happen to shoot a deer, make sure that the family understands where it is and what it's all about, and that everybody's understanding that this occurred and here's why this is important and good, really. Because now I've got to deal with my mom, who just frowns every time I shoot a deer.
I see. Yeah, it's a process. Yeah, it's funny how it turns out that way.
My grandfather is the same person that really taught me a lot about the outdoors and about fishing and hunting and just being a steward of the wildlife and of the mountains, basically. So.
Yeah, and I had that same influence. We were my birth gift on the day that I was born was a spinning rod and reel for fishing. So started fishing and hunting at a very early age. I wasn't able to hunt when I was very young, but followed my father and grandfather everywhere, and really learned a lot about the outdoors from them. And not every kid is fortunate enough to have that. A lot of us find ourselves kind of having to learn how to do all these things on their own. But I was very fortunate in that I had family and friends that I could lean on to learn all these things, like you mentioned.
Gotcha. Very, very cool. I want to get into some of your influences in a second, but can we touch on this whole 12-year-old hunting rule? What's your opinion of that law?
Well, since then they've changed it where you can be accompanied by an adult, and I think they've dropped the bow hunting age down to 10 in this area.
Okay.
And I really think it's up to us as parents and adults if we feel that we have a child that's developed emotionally and has enough responsibility to go ahead and go out and do that. I don't have any reason to not be in favor of it. I think they should be given that opportunity.
Okay.
At age 12, I was definitely more than ready and demonstrated. I went out on my own and shot a buck and successfully harvested it. Yeah. So I think it depends a lot on the parents. If they're keeping an eye on the development of their kids and where they're at with their hunting, I think they can pretty much gauge whether or not it's the right thing to do, I guess would be the wording that I would search for.
Tell me about some of your influences growing up. Who are some of the people that really guided you and formed your hunting philosophy and strategies and techniques? Well,
mostly it was family. I've also interacted with some of the top deer hunters in this area at one time or another. One of the family friends was extraordinarily successful and still a state record holder with the largest non-typical in Michigan and that sort of a thing. So those were the people that I really looked up to. And my uncles and my grandparents, and I got to see their mounted bucks and listen to their stories. And so they've kind of embedded the culture in me at a very early age. They were very big influences on me. And so I had some relatives and some friends who were capable of taking some very mature bucks. And I admired them very much and tried to mimic them. And then when you spend enough time in the woods, as you know, you tend to learn a lot of things on your own as well. And you just hopefully put the whole program together. So I would say primarily close friends and family were my biggest influences on my deer hunting. It was just such a strong tradition, and I wanted to be part of it so bad that I emulated them. I learned from them. And then, as you know, I learned on my own as well.
Gotcha. All right. Can we talk about your grandfather a little bit? In the pre-chat, you had shared with me that you have a picture of a buck that your grandfather shot from 1913.
I have a picture of that buck, and it's one of the largest bucks that's been taken by my family. That particular buck actually dressed out over 300 pounds on a commercial scale.
Wow.
So that's quite a large deer. It had a huge rack as well. He actually found that buck while he was duck hunting. He was floating in Michigan River and happened to see the buck in its bed and continued floating on down to duck hunt and came back with a deer rifle later and managed to stalk up on the buck and made a good shot and got him that way. But that buck was just enormous. We've got one picture of it. One of my cousins has a picture of it hanging on the loading docks at the family fishing operation there. And you'll very rarely see a picture of any whitetail with a chest as big as this one. I have seen a couple of historical photos, but the chest top to bottom on that particular buck was just off the charts. Very, very impressive animal.
It kind of brings up an interesting concept of float hunting. You know, I've never really done that, but I've heard some guys and gals will do a float down a river to identify areas where bucks live. It sounds like that was an inadvertent. Do you think that there's a method there that could be applied in strategy?
Definitely, and we still see that here in Michigan. I still have friends that float rivers and are successful in that way. Whether they're floating down to a particular spot or they're actually quietly floating up on a buck and taking a shot at it with their bow and arrow. We still do that here in Michigan.
Gotcha.
Some of them are very successful. We've got so many waterways here in Michigan that there's a lot of rivers to float that go through public land, state land, national forests, and that sort of thing. So I still see that here in Michigan, and I have friends that to this day still do that to take bucks.
Well, fascinating concept, and it's something I always wanted to try.
Yeah, and, I did it in kind of a roundabout way. When I was a younger man, I was a drift boat guide for steelhead. I don't know if you know what a drift boat is. It's kind of a banana-shaped boat with long oars and paddle and fish for steelhead. And when I was guiding with my drift boat, quite often I'd float up on some bedding areas that are on big bends in the river and see some bucks that would just stand there and stare at us. And then I would come back later actually on land or by boat, whatever worked the best, and try to move in and set up on that buck. It's been quite a while since I've hunted that way, but it is something that I've done in the past.
No kidding. So your grandfather actually killed a huge buck doing it that way. That is one heck of a good story. I'll have to see the picture of that deer.
Yeah, it's very large, very impressive. It's very old photograph. We're lucky to still have it. We do have some pictures of the family going back to, the 1850s and stuff like that, but that's one of the oldest remaining buck photos that we have from the family.
So tell me about the styles of hunting that you engage in now.
Well, a lot of the technique and style that I use, I inherited from the family. I'm primarily a deep cedar swamp hunter in places that other hunters don't want to go, in the places that I typically favor. I don't see other hunters because they're afraid to go there. So that's something that I do on purpose to limit hunting pressure. Some other influences that I've had is like my friend Dan Infalt in Wisconsin.
Yep.
I'm already hunting swamps, which are bedding areas, but Dan was very adamant on actually getting right up on top of the bedded bucks, and it certainly accelerated my success. But I had already had success prior to that. When I looked at Dan's technique of actually moving up on the beds themselves, it did improve my success rate. In some of the areas that I hunt, not in the cedar swamps around home here, what I call combat hunting, you really do have to be on top of those buck beds to have any chance of taking the animal, whether it's with bow or gun.
Okay.
So those are some pretty strong influences. I've had, earlier I mentioned a friend of the family that's been a very successful hunter. as a youth, I've watched him put on a wetsuit deep in a swamp, in Beaver Ponds, deep in a cedar swamp.
Yeah.
Hold his rifle over his head and swim across the ponds in the middle of deer season. Get on the other side of the pond, climb up in a tree, spot a bedded buck, move over towards them, and take a shot. So that demonstrated to me the extent of how far some hunters are willing to go, and it really depends on how bad you want it. You can't get a kayak back there, you can't get a canoe back there or anything, and he came in with a wetsuit. Is one of the most successful hunters in the history of our state. So things like that influenced me, and I saw, what it would take to be successful sometimes, how far you would have to go. So those were some strong influences.
Okay. Let's talk about your pre-Dan Infalt days where you were hunting these cedar swamps. What were the things that you were looking for in these swamps, and how did you go about your daily hunt?
Well, these big conifer swamps, like a cedar swamp, have incredibly dense canopy, so they're not like a lot of other swamps. Your visibility is very limited, but traditionally that's where I grew up, and that's where my family hunted. So we had trails that were marked in a way that only we understood, that were staggered so that others couldn't follow us, and we did have others try to follow us. Wow. But our standard hunting attire would be hip boots, and our weapon, compasses, some of the most important things that we had. And you really did have to know how to navigate in these swamps. It's really not some place for someone without any experience to go. You really need to spend some time learning from someone that's done this so that you don't become lost. I've rescued a number of hunters over the years that were lost, with law enforcement trying to find them and that sort of a thing. So my favorite hunting is in swamps of that type. I pretty much have it to myself. Other hunters don't penetrate that far, and because they're afraid of the swamps typically. The only other hunters that do penetrate that far in my hunting areas are people that I knew. And then my other favorite type of hunting, again, is in swamps and habitat in the upper peninsula of Michigan, which is very different from the lower peninsula. And then probably my absolute favorite hunting, because I'm completely left alone without other hunters, is in Ontario. And I hunt the northern edge of the Whitetails Range in Ontario after meeting with Canadian biologists. And they are some of the largest bodied deer on earth. And I didn't have a lot of success with them. I did have some, but to be in the game with whitetails that are that big was an exceptional standard for me. I think back when my great-grandfather used to hunt, there were some big bucks like that one that we talked about that dressed over 300 pounds. Yeah. It's become more and more difficult to find bucks that are reaching that age. So when I go up to Ontario and hunt those areas on the edge of the Whitetails Range, simply being in the game with deer that are that large is something that I seek. Now, I don't have anything against the super high pressure that we have here in mid-Michigan. I hunt here as well, but it's a very different type of hunting. So I kind of tempered the super high hunting pressure that I have here in mid-Michigan by going to the Upper Peninsula, by going up into northern Ontario, where I have pretty much the entire hunting area to myself for the most part.
Okay. All right. So the whole idea of going into these cedar swamps sounds like it was predicated partly based off of just where other hunters weren't. Kind of like what Dan Infalt had mentioned, that he likes to hunt where people don't go because that's where the big deer tend to roam. That's true. Was that the motivation behind the cedar swamps, or was it more just something that was handed down from generation to generation as to where to go?
Well, we did a lot of that in gun season, so that's why I learned it, because there's so much pressure surrounding these swamps that the bigger bucks, a lot of them would migrate deep into the interior. And so then I began to enjoy that, and I took it over into my bow hunting as well, to hunt for some of the local bucks there in my bow hunting area. So having some success and getting away from other hunters was just a very big and real part of that for me, and something that I enjoy is kind of going one-on-one with bucks. There's not a big deer population back in those big cedar swamps, but they have the ability to interact with the other deer, carry on with the rut, move between doe areas without interference from hunters. These swamps are so big, so dense, and so full of water. Back in some of the areas that I hunt, you could sink a buffalo and never see it again. It's very thick and remote, but the bucks are there.
Okay.
Probably one of the neater examples that we have of the influence of hunting pressure. We have local bucks that I kind of watch the entire year, and then we have some transient bucks. And there's two different large transient buck periods that I see in my swamps. The end of October, you kind of have leaf drop, and the deer the bigger bucks kind of move towards the heavier cover naturally anyway. Mm-hmm. But there's a little bit of an increase in hunting pressure then, and then the rut periods are starting. So bucks, bedding areas that haven't been active all year suddenly will become active with what I call transient bucks moving into them, primarily to be near those does. And then the other really large transition period that I see is that Michigan gun deer season. My father had a blind deep in a cedar swamp, and it was either 12 or 13 years in a row. On the second day of the Michigan gun deer season, it's always November 16th, he shot a good buck for that area, almost always between 9 and noon. So that's far too much to be a coincidence, 12 or 13 years in a row.
Right.
And I think what we were seeing there was in the uplands is the masses, the 750,000 gun deer hunters in Michigan took to the highlands. A lot of those bucks would move deep into the cedar swamp.
Gotcha. All right. So there you go where they go. You go where the bucks are. That's the basic principle of hunting. Don't hunt where you think they are. Hunt where they are.
Correct. And a lot of what was going on there, Jay, is on opening day, the 15th, the gun deer season, those bucks would hunker down in some cover that they could find and kind of ride it out.
Yeah.
And then that evening after dark, we get done hunting and go back to the family camp and have some dinner. But then we get in our trucks and drive around the outer edge of these huge swamps on the road that was closest to them. And we would actually physically see some good bucks moving into the swamp after dark. We never saw bucks coming out the other way. In fact, one of the memorable events that we had is we were in my dad's truck one day, and a pretty good buck ran right into the passenger door and caved it in.
Right.
So a lot of movement to hide in the interior of these swamps that were based on that pressure.
Gotcha. All right. Let's talk about some of your strategies that you use to engage in these swamps. I mean, this is not super easy. It's not easy walking. You're going to get wet. You need the proper equipment. You mentioned hip boots. How do you prepare to go into the swamp, both gear-wise, mentally, and what is it that you're scouting for and looking for, if there's any scouting at all, or you just know that once you get in that your chances are high, there's not a lot of scouting that needs to be done?
I have, in Canada, it's very different because that's a place that I'm leaving for and don't get to spend a lot of time there. So that's a little bit of a different style. But here in Michigan, when I move in these big cedar swamps that I've been spending my entire life in, I pretty much expect to know when the bucks are going to show up in certain areas. And what I'm looking for with the hip boots on, we put the warmer clothes in a backpack or in a roll on the back and use our staggered trails so that we can't be followed to penetrate. And then we'll go back to traditional big buck bedding areas such as islands deep within the swamp. There's some transition areas where you may have flooded beaver ponds that edge up against the cedars in the regular part of the swamp. Those differences in terrain are very important for buck bedding.
Okay.
And it can be something as simple as a different type of tree lining up against a different species of tree. Those bucks will take advantage of that transition and find a spot where the wind currents in the swamp are to their advantage, and they will bed there. So we've learned over time the areas where the bucks traditionally, based on air currents, like to move through, where they like to bed, and where we're going to hunt. An example I can give you of one of the best spots are those beaver ponds that I mentioned earlier. They literally contain everything that a mature buck needs. Because it's an opening, there's thick regrowth along the edge, which supplies their food. It's heavy cover for their bedding. Mm-hmm. Based on any wind direction, they can set up in any direction around the edge of that pond. So if the wind's out of the north today and they're bedding on the north side, and the wind's out of the south tomorrow, well, they bed over on the south side. And they sit there and watch out over the more open area with the wind and the thickness of the swamp protecting their back. And I think you'll find this technique a little interesting. It's a hunting technique that I developed on my own. I've never really heard of anyone else doing it. When I reached the understanding of hunting these bucks that they tend to like to bed against a barrier, whether it's a beaver pond, a creek, a muck area, a blowdown area from a tornado, whatever the case may be. I would come in gun season if I hadn't been successful with my bow. And I understand that they're bedded against that big beaver pond. Let's use that as an example. And so I have a pretty good idea of about where they're going to be bedded. And based on the wind direction that day, I know which side of the pond they're going to be on typically. And I also know that because I'm coming in on the other side, they're going to be watching in my direction.
Okay.
And so what I do is I very silently and slowly stalk up. I've got a tree stand and a couple of sticks on my back. And when there's some noise or a gust of wind, I'll stay on the opposite side of the tree on the edge of that pond and put a couple sticks on and get up into the tree a little bit. And then when the wind blows or an airplane flies over or something like that, I'll very stealthily hang the stand and slip into it and become a statue. So I've shot bucks when they've stood up in their bed doing that on the other side of the pond. I've shot a buck that moved 18 feet from his bed, and a number of others that were less than 100 yards from their bed using that tactic. And you don't see that tactic used too often. That was something that I kind of developed on my own. The other things that we do is once we understand where the buck bedding areas are deep in these swamps, and we understand the wind currents and how they move through those coniferous trees and the cedars, we'll set up just off of those bedding areas on those travel transitions, whether it's on the edge of a beaver pond or a creek or two different tree types or habitat types. We're not very far off of that bedding. And whether we're hunting with a bow or our gun, that's primarily how we set up. Now, we do have to understand where these exits are and these entrances into these buck bedding areas because it's so thick and there's so limited visibility that if you don't understand what trails those bucks are going to use, whether it's the rut and they're going in between doe families or it's not the rut and it's a local buck, you have to be able to cover that trail with very limited visibility. So there's a lot more that goes into it than what it sounds like. You can't just go set up back there. You have to understand the habits of the deer and where they're going to move and set up to intercept them based on the weather conditions of that day.
So how do you decide or learn the habits of these bucks and how they travel in and out of their beds?
Well, when I was very young, I didn't really understand very well. My father or my uncle would say, "Here, hunt here," and a buck would show up and I'd shoot it.
Right.
And I didn't understand that they understood exactly what those bucks were doing. But, as I got a little bit older and they explained it to me and I started backtracking bucks even outside of deer season in the snow to see how they were utilizing those areas, then, you always repeat that pattern. You look for similar bedding based on a big buck bed that you found. If you can duplicate that in other areas of your swamp, and it doesn't have to be a swamp, that can be any hunting area, that's what you do, and you set up based on the wind and the air currents to take that buck when he exits his bedding area.
Okay.
So it's something that was kind of taught to me by relatives setting me down there and me somehow shooting a buck, and then transitioning through the understanding of what was actually happening there. And then as I developed as a hunter, my relatives would better inform me as to what I was looking at. But also I learned a lot on my own. I've made a lot of mistakes. I've jumped a lot of bucks out of their beds by accident because I got too close. I'm one of those guys that gets too aggressive. I'm not the typical hunter that's not aggressive enough that stays back and then never sees the buck during the daylight. So those are things that I've acquired in a combination between family, relatives, and learning things on my own.
Okay. All right. And if you decide to set up your stand, you said that you have the strategy of stealthily moving in quietly based off of airplane flying over.
Right.
Is there something I assume that placement of that stand is connected to your understanding of how those bucks are going to travel, which sounds like it's part asking around, learning from tradition and your own experiences.
Yeah, and there's more to it than that. The gun tactic that I mentioned earlier where I come up on the other side and the deer's bedded and facing that direction.
Yep.
Typically when I look across the barrier, whether it's muck or a river or a beaver pond or what have you, when I see just the tiniest little point of woods that's sticking out into it, I'm thinking that that's a bedding spot for a buck. And you also need to understand their typical behavior when these bucks stand up in their beds, you may not immediately see them, but they don't just get up and walk out on their exit run.
Okay.
When you observe these bucks over decades, they'll get up in their bed. Most of the time, they will come over to the edge of the barrier. So we were using the Beaver Pond as an example.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll rise from their bed, walk over to the edge of the pond. Maybe they'll take a drink, maybe they won't. But they'll actually stand there for several minutes looking, watching, listening, and smelling to make sure that everything in their little immediate safety zone is okay. And then they'll turn around and move either laterally or deeper into the swamp to go out on their exit trail. So understanding the behavior of these bucks and their actions when they actually stand up in their bed can go a long ways toward you understanding how you are going to set up to intercept them. Whether it's gun season and I'm setting up on the other side of the pond and sometimes literally watching them stand up, or because I understand their behavior that they like to come down many times to the edge of the barrier before they head out on their exit trail. Sometimes that's what I take advantage of. Bow hunting is completely different. You've got to get around to their exit routes. If they're coming out on 2 different beaver dams on the edges of that pond, you might be able to take them there. If that's not an option, you may have to come in on the other side and set up without spooking the buck out on one of his exit trails and hope that you get a shot.
Gotcha. Let's try to talk about the barrier that these bucks are setting up on in a little more depth. So you're saying
they're defending themselves. Yeah. What they'll typically do, if you can picture a beaver pond that's maybe oblong in shape,
yep.
Not a huge pond, usually 100 yards or so or less across the pond. A lot of times what the bucks will do is they will come in the early morning on the downwind side of the pond.
Okay.
So they're actually on the other side of the pond from their bed, but the wind is blowing toward them and they have no difficulty at all. They scent check and clear their bed from the other side of the pond, and then they'll walk up to a beaver dam or hook around the pond and come back to their bed. That
Gotcha.
last little movement, they'll either come in from the side or they'll come in from the back, and they'll lay down on the edge of that barrier. And now what they've got is they can see across the pond. Nothing can get near them without tipping them off that it's coming predator-wise. And they've got the wind and the thickness of the swamp protecting their backside, and you can't get near them when they're in their bed.
Gotcha.
They're very well protected.
So you're saying that they'll come up, they're smelling the wind as it's in their face. They'll come up to the edge of this pond.
Right.
And they're doing a check. They're doing a smell check on the other side of the pond to see if there's anything they don't like where they want to go to sleep.
Exactly. They're on the other side of the pond. They're wind checking their bed, scent checking and clearing it. They're smelling for coyotes. They're smelling for wolves. They're smelling for humans. If their sense of smell is incredible, and we have a difficult time understanding how reliant they are, but that is what they do. They scent check and clear their bed in that example most of the time, and then they'll hook around and bed over on the other side of the pond.
Okay, so in order to hook around, are they taking like the shortest distance around the edge of the pond? Or are they riding just inside the wood line?
It'll either be their trail that they're traveling on the other side of the pond from where they're going to bed is pretty close to that barrier. So they scent check and clear it, and then they move forward and they'll cross either on a beaver dam, or if the pond just somehow comes to an end, they'll go around that corner and come back. They've already scent checked and cleared that entire other area on the other side of the pond. They know that there's nothing there to be afraid of. Okay. And then they'll move into their bed.
Gotcha. So they could potentially go around the pond, or if there's a land bridge of some sort.
And we see a lot of land bridges. That's an excellent description. The land bridge can be an old beaver dam, can be a variety of things that'll take them over there. Okay. But usually, once they've scent checked and cleared it, they will take that shortest route around. They won't go any farther than they have to.
Okay. Now, this place where they have decided they want to bed, what does it generally look like? Are there any geographical descriptions that more often than not kind of play out? Meaning that is it jetting out into the swamp itself a little bit, or does it have any other features?
It typically is, but it's so minuscule in size. I mean, it just takes the tiniest little point where they can have water on 3 sides of them and then watch down across the pond. So it doesn't take much. not all of the beds will even have that. If there's a big blown down tree in that area, they'll put that big blown down tree to their back and then watch across the pond. But typically there's just this tiniest little bit advantage that they'll take care of. But they don't really even need that. The swamps that I hunt are so thick that they are going to hear any predator coming, whether they smell it or not. The wind's coming from their backside. They're just so well defended in those beds. It's just the perfect place for a buck to lay down and not be bothered by predators. If predators do come in, they detect them with ease. They can escape around either end of the pond. They can escape deeper into the swamp. Worst case scenario for the buck, he jumps into the pond, swims across it, and escapes out on the other side.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Now, your strategy for hunting that area sounds like it varies based off your gun or bow. Like they're not the same.
Yep. A lot of times, if I'm hunting a series of beaver dams and beaver ponds, if I'm bow hunting, I'll sneak in and set up to cover that crossing where that buck comes out on that beaver dam. Or if he's not crossing the beaver dam, I'll set up to cover that run over on the other side. And that's versus gun hunting, where I'm so aggressive with my approach, super quiet, take my time. But I'm actually looking for those bucks to stand up and move to the edge of the barrier before they head out on their exit trail. Okay. So two different strategies. And when I do the gun thing, I constantly have to tell myself that buck is looking right over here. So I play the conditions, I play the wind, I play the sound of an airplane flying over. I don't get way up in the tree. If you're going to climb way up in the tree, he's going to spot you, and you're all done. A lot of my stands in that scenario were 6-8 feet off the ground, and that's it.
Okay. All right. You're just trying to get a visual to the edge somehow.
Correct.
And are most of these techniques done at the end of the day, or is this a morning situation or middle?
Yeah, no, that's an evening hunt. Okay. Yeah, I should have clarified that. Okay. That's an evening hunt. I want to know where that buck is, and when he's in his bed, I've got a pretty good idea. Even if I've never been there before and I'm guessing, I've shot bucks that way. Okay. But if I have knowledge of the area and have already located those beds, then I can make my approach even cleaner and make sure that he can't see me as I'm coming in.
Okay. And are you assuming that the buck is there, or he's there?
I've done both. If I haven't been into an area for a while, but I've taken bucks in that area in the past, I'll come in and do a blind hunt. Okay. But typically what I like to do is verify that I have a buck in that area. So without disturbing the bedded buck, I will walk through a nearby funnel in the big woods or the wilderness area, close enough to the bed that I can tell that he is using it without scaring the buck. Maybe it's a creek crossing deep in the swamp, and I see that oversized track pointed towards that bedding area. That's really all I need to move in and make my hunt. I have a few trail cameras, but I have so many places that I hunt. They're, not used that much. I rely on tracks and track size. I rely on dropping size, which is very unusual, I think, for most hunters. If you've got some fresh scrapes that have opened up. Another thing that I see in the big woods and wilderness areas is I'll usually find one big rub, even if it's a long ways away from that bedding area, and I'll be able to relate it to that bedding area and know that he's in this area and move in and hunt on those beds that I have experience with.
Okay. So you're doing a check of the surroundings.
Right, without scaring the bedded buck.
Right.
Yep.
Trying to stay far enough away without spooking them. And you're looking for signs of basically just footprints, it sounds like, and droppings. Those are your two bigger signs.
Those are my two bigger signs. And, droppings are really overlooked. People overlook tracks too and think that does make giant tracks. Sometimes they do, but most of the time they don't. But when I'm finding fresh deer droppings that have been dropped in the last 24 hours, right, and the average pellet length is over 3/4 of an inch in the droppings, yep, I'm looking at a buck. And if I have an idea of where he's going to be bedding, those droppings alone will get me to move into that area, and I've successfully taken the buck. So have my friends and family.
It's interesting you say that because Ken Nordberg mentions that a lot.
Mm-hmm. I'm familiar with Ken. Yeah.
Yeah. He's one of the things that he really emphasized was the size of the droppings. Always the size of the droppings. That's going to indicate what size buck you're playing with, if you can find.
Yeah, I think it's pretty logical biologically. I mean, if you have a 5.5-year-old buck that we see the Coke can droppings. So you're sure not going to see that with any other deer. If you've got droppings that are like some that I'm hunting or going to hunt this fall that I just found and filmed for the Hunting Beast, if you've got Coke can sized droppings, all the pellets together are coming out the size of a Coke can.
Yep.
You don't see that in big does. That is a big mature whitetail buck. And then when you actually measure the pellet length and you've got 1.5 inch long pellets, that's just an enormous old buck. A lot of hunters don't really know what they're looking at. And I like to touch on that a little bit, a little bit more if I can, Jay.
Definitely.
The modern hunter is very reliant on trail cameras, and rightfully so. Everybody likes to see their pictures. But deep in these big woods and swamp areas, I've got so many places that I hunt that unless I have 100 cameras and I'm able to go in and monitor, it's not going to work for me. And it's so physically challenging to get into these swamps in the first place. I only have a few cameras out. I have an interesting combat hunt story here right by my home, hunting some big woods, overrun with hunters.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a buck that I was targeting, parked my truck, grab all my gear, I'm going to walk down this dirt road for a little ways before I break into the swamp. And 4 days in a row, I cut this absolutely enormous buck track. And the fourth day, I couldn't believe it, so I actually had to go hunt this buck. But literally, there were well over 100 hunters driving by these tracks, and they really had no idea that this was a big buck. They were all racing to go check their trail cameras to try to find a big buck. And here's these absolutely enormous tracks on the road that no one pays any attention to. So, sometimes I like to say you need to be able to see the forest from the trees and interpret what you're looking at, whether it's a giant oversized track or droppings that are so much bigger than all the other deer. We need to use our hair-covered computers to understand what we're looking at and move in. Now, that big buck that was crossing the road, I couldn't take it anymore after the fourth day. And I dug out my topo out of my pack, and I saw what looked like a bedding area with a little point sticking out into a marsh.
Yep.
And so I snuck in and got just a little bit too close and blew him out of the bed. So I took pictures of his rub in his bed and took pictures of the bed itself. But yeah, nobody had that buck on trail camera as far as I can tell. And if they did, it was in the middle of the night, and everybody's driving by those tracks. And we really need to take a look at all the deer sign, not just your trail cam photos.
This is a fascinating concept to me, that you can take a track, pull out your topo map, and then look at a spot how far was that track from the bed?
It was about 3/4 of a mile. And
wow.
But when you get good at understanding how bucks like to bed, you can do that. I have friends and family that are more than capable of doing that. I remember when you interviewed Dan Infalt, my friend over there in Wisconsin. Same kind of thing, he'll understand exactly where that buck's headed and move in and set up on them. So it's not something that you learn how to do overnight. If you don't understand a lot about tracks, you need to start driving those sandy and dirt roads in your area. And when you see an oversized track and it's by itself, which is rare for does and fawns, that should be a tip off to you that you're probably looking at a buck track. And if you can start following that buck around a little bit, watching for his tracks and figuring out where he beds, that's the plan, and that's what we take advantage of.
Okay. And when you're looking at these topo maps, and you just
right.
and it must register with you. It's like a reticular activator. Once you've identified one, you start to identify all of them.
Right.
Do you start looking at multiple potential bedding areas at that point, or is it more blatantly obvious, like this is most likely the one, and do you rank them, like this is probably one, or maybe this is the other one, but this is probably the number one choice? How do you decide?
Yeah, and quite often I'll see more than one, and with a lot of experience, I'm able to say this is probably where the biggest mature buck in this particular area is bedding. And typically it's because you really can't see it on the ground. In the swamps, to be honest, I can't even see, there won't even be a little donut-shaped topo mark, and I may be more reliant on aerial photographs and things that I have just found on foot. But when you become familiar with these bedding areas in the big woods and in wilderness areas like up in Canada that I hunt, you can see a number of beds, and you may be able to pick them off one at a time, moving towards that primary bed if there isn't a lot of hunting pressure. If there is a lot of hunting pressure like I have here at home, and the conditions are right, the wind direction, the weather, I can pretty much pick that bed out of those 3 or 4 that he's probably going to be in, and move in on the best bedding area. I've got one really big buck that I'm setting up to hunt right now that you can't see anything of his little micro island that he beds on. Coke can droppings, big rubs, giant tracks, and I've been hunting him for 3 years now. I call him Hoppy because when I kicked him out of his bed as a 3-year-old, he hopped away and stopped and looked back, so that's the name that I gave him.
Yep.
But he's at least a 5-year-old, possibly a 6-year-old, and from Michigan public land, that's extraordinary.
Right.
And his primary favorite bedding area you can't see on any topo map, and on an aerial photograph you really can't see it either until I found it. And then when I found it, I can just make out by changing the coloration of the aerial photo that there's just this little tiny micro island that doesn't stick out at all. And that's why he spends most of his time there. There's never any human scent back there. So once you find an area like that, then again, our goal is to always to try to duplicate it in other areas, that particular type of big buck bedding. And that's why he's a ghost to all the other hunters. There's probably guys getting some trail cam pictures of this huge buck. But they have no idea where he spends his daylight hours, and he's not going to move far before dark. If you don't have an understanding of his bedding areas, the 3, 4, maybe even 5 that he uses, and then in other areas, there's probably different seasons of the year where he's bedded elsewhere. But that's what we do. That's what we have to try to understand and move in and hunt those bucks.
Gotcha. Okay. So once you've identified one, I mean, it sounds like it's a very, very subtle type thing that you probably overlooked a bunch of times until you figured it out.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I've overlooked it and kind of stumbled onto this where this very large mature buck was bedding. In this particular area, he's got 4 different beds that I know that he uses that I've already been in this winter and found sign from him last fall, and a couple of them he's still even using right now. So it's his home core area, and he spends a lot of time there.
Okay.
But yeah, I always try to duplicate what I have found. Even in hill country, farm country, if you find the bed of a mature buck, you need to take a look all around this bed and say, why is he bedding here, and where else that I have permission to hunt could I duplicate this? And that's how you start stacking up those hunting areas.
Okay. Other guys that are thinking about this, is it something that you can, through trial and error, figure out over time? And you did it, but is it something that the common hunter will do, or is this just too deep in the woods, too much work, too much effort? Sounds like you're scouting frequently, even off season,
right?
To figure out is this a weekend hunter project, or is this something that you really kind of need to be a student?
You really do need to be a student to find it, I think, at that level. I scout the entire year round. But again, it doesn't have to be complex. If you locate the bedding area of a mature buck and try to duplicate it, you'll get a better understanding. And really, it boils down to being able to identify buck bedding areas, especially in high pressure areas like around my home. You have to be able to understand what that buck is looking for. And once you start to see those conditions, you'll be able to move in on your own and find them. Even if I've got a couple of feet of snow on the ground, if I move into an area here at home and I identify a buck bedding area, I'll see a tree. It may not have a rub on it at all. There may be no rubs in the bed, which is pretty common for mature bucks around here. Mm-hmm. But I can walk over to the tree. I'll kick off the 2 feet of snow. Take my gloved hand and scratch up the ground and pull up deer hair, and then I know, yes, this is a buck bed.
Okay.
So to get to that point, you do have to spend a lot of time in the woods, I think.
Okay, let's change the scenario a little bit. Is hunting pressure an essential aspect of where these bucks are headed, which in turn is a crucial aspect of how you hunt. If the hunting pressure were to just disappear, do the bucks do the same thing?
Yeah, and the mature bucks tend to do the same thing, because in any given area, there's only so many beds that a truly mature buck is going to use that give him the best advantage. And the hunting pressure, whether it's high or it's low, that's kind of where the mature buck is going to go. The big difference is in the lower pressure areas, and I don't think a lot of people really have an understanding of what severe hunting pressure is. I will add that. But in the lower pressure areas, those bucks will get up and they'll move a greater distance before dark. Now, in a super high pressure area like I have here at home, even the 2.5-year-old bucks, the 3-year-old buck's a really good buck here. But even the 2.5-year-old bucks, a lot of times they've already got bullets and broadheads in them. They're incredibly bashful, and I watch them hold the water in these swamps, and they won't even step out onto dry land until dark. So when a 3-year-old stands up in my area here at home, if you're not within 100 yards of that bed, you really don't have much of a chance. We all like to read about and watch, bucks during the rut phases, cruising between doe areas, checking on does, checking on parallel trails to fields, and that doesn't happen here at my home. If a buck moves 200 yards, he's dead. He's shot.
Okay.
So you can't really set up to cover that and hope to be successful. So then what we end up with is when you have bucks in high pressure areas like here in the Northeast and Pennsylvania and anywhere there's really high hunting pressure, if you have a hunter who becomes successful in taking really good bucks for that area in the really high pocket of hunting pressure, those same hunters can move to other areas with less pressure and be very successful.
Gotcha. All right. So because they expand their range slightly, and that is an upper hand for people that are hunting in these 100 yards or less type scenarios.
You've got to be pretty close. And sometimes these big bucks will make a mistake. One of my hunting areas here in mid-Michigan, I've seen one of my target bucks, a very mature buck, show up on the edge of a field on November 2nd. Mm-hmm. But what are the odds that you're going to be on the edge of that field on November 2nd at 2 p.m. and then every other night he's not leaving his bedding area? So, these bucks do make mistakes, and some of them get shot, but it's pretty rare. And that's why we emphasize in the really high pressure areas how close you need to be to those buck beds.
Gotcha. Do you think, like, if you see a buck, if you get a visual on a buck that seems unusual because they just don't do that typically, and can you then locate through topographical analysis the most likely spot where that buck went after that visual observation?
Yeah, I can typically with aerials and or topos figure out where he was headed. Now they will, if they're in water, hunters don't like to get into water. They'll do more movement than they will in other types of terrain. So a lot of times, even in high pressure areas, I'm able to locate where the bucks are coming in and out of these wetlands. And I already have an understanding of where they're headed. If I'm not familiar with the area, looking at some aerial photographs and some topos, you can kind of figure out where that buck is moving to and what he's going to do when he steps outside of that bedding area. Yes, you're right.
Okay. Let's talk about your combat hunt a little bit more. Can you describe that in a little more detail and what that means?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, it's so embedded into the culture here to hunt that nearly every man, woman, and child hunts. So you have just tremendous hunting pressure. If you walk around on public land on November 15th around my home here, you're probably going to be watched by a scope or three, hopefully accidentally. So that's a lot of pressure. And these bucks will move to pockets where there is no human scent. It's not that they're incredibly intelligent. They're using their instincts against predators to move into little pockets of cover in these combat zones to bed where the hunters aren't going. Can give you a couple of examples of that. They're very overlooked areas. We've got a couple of county roads that come together on public land, and there's some deep ditches with deep water. And when all of our hunters in this area go to hunt, they either access where all the hunters access and hunt close to the road, or the younger guys like to go way back. Well, the bucks smell all of these hunters and they avoid those areas. Well, where that little road intersection is with the deep ditches, that little point of land that butts up against that intersection, the first good cover up from that point, a lot of times I'll find a nice buck bedded right there with the wind at his back watching the road. And none of the hunters think to walk down to that corner and see if there's a buck bedded down there. They just don't think there's going to be a buck there. So that's just one example. The other example that we see a lot is if you can find an area where there's no trees big enough for a tree stand. It's a near certainty that I'll be able to walk into that area and find the big tracks, the big droppings, and some beds of a good buck for that area. It may be a young clear cut that's just too small to hold any tree stands. Or it may just be that the soils are so bad there just aren't any trees in that immediate area that are big enough to put a tree stand in. And it's almost a guarantee that the biggest buck in that particular area may be taking up shop there.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's bring and introduce in Dan Infalt into your repertoire. How did he influence some of the things you had already been doing? It sounds like you had a pretty solid base anyway, but you said that Dan kind of helped you understand a couple of additional points. What did he help you with?
He did. Yeah. Dan's an excellent hunter. The concept of moving directly on top of the buck's bedding area. I'm not off in the distance like I used to be when I was younger. With his influence and understanding, and, we've seen how much success he's had. Then I took it upon myself to move up as close as I possibly can to the buck's bed and without spooking him out. And that's when I really started becoming a little bit more successful with both weapons, more daytime movement, and really a better understanding of how the bucks utilize their area. You can still be very successful in swamps, marshes, and bogs by hunting transitions that are near areas that look like you're going to have bedding. And typically that's what I did, and I had a lot of success. But why not put it in your favor even that much more? If you're going to get your human scent in there anyway, you might as well move up on the bed. And so that was probably Dan's strongest influence for me. Dan's a very unusual individual. I mean, he's willing to share with all of us all of his techniques. And on his hunting forum there, I mean, he's willing to tell anyone what he believes will work the best. And it's pretty rare to see a hunter of his talent being able to take the time and share with all of us all of their methodology. Right. And so that the bedding influence, I would say, of getting on top of the beds was a puzzle piece for me that my friend Dan provided.
Gotcha. All right. And are there other puzzle pieces missing still, do you think? Are there things that you're still trying to figure out?
Well, probably the biggest thing that I'm trying to figure out now is time. I've got some fairly young kids at home, football, baseball, soccer. Yep. And I also have a very demanding job. So my biggest puzzle that I need to overcome, to answer your question, would be finding the time. If you're only going to spend, you can have all the buck knowledge that you want, but if you're only going to spend 30 hours a year in a tree stand, you're probably not going to be very successful. So that's what a lot of us are up against. So the puzzle piece remaining for me, I believe, would be to find out, I'll have to be honest with you. I used to pride myself on being able to kill a 3-year-old in Michigan public land with less than 20 hours on stand. Right. And then I'd move on. But that's not going to work for big mature bucks, especially in high pressure areas. So that's my biggest challenge, I think.
Okay. Gotcha. What about weather and fronts and moon phases and that kind of thing? Do you pay attention to that stuff?
I do. It really depends on where I'm hunting. Just to be honest with you, moon phase, cold fronts moving in, when you're in an area with severe hunting pressure, it's not going to help you a whole heck of a lot. If I'm in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan or if I'm up in Canada, it can definitely stimulate movement. Some good moon phases and approaching cold front or right after the cold front hits, I'll definitely see more movement from the bucks in that situation. But when you have bucks who are conditioned repeatedly, like here at my home, where a half hour before dark, they hear over a dozen truck doors slam from all of the hunters that are afraid of the dark. When they hear all of the hunters blowing their grunt calls repeatedly, day after day after day, everywhere they go, they learn to avoid, they associate grunt calls with hunting pressure. In those scenarios, you're not going to have much of an impact from moon phase, from weather. They've got bullets in them. They've got broadheads in them. They understand that waiting until after dark to move very far from their bed is very important. And let me give you a quick example here. If you duck hunt the marshes here around my home, the ducks very quickly learn when shooting time ends. And so after the first few days, the local ducks will stay in their little preserve and wait until shooting hours are over and you're pulling your decoys, and the ducks come in by the hundreds and circle my canoe and my decoys. And that is an animal with a pea-sized brain that understands to wait until dark to come over to my decoys. Well, if you've got a mature 4.5, 5.5-year-old buck in a super high hunting pressure area, he knows the game. And if you're not right on top of that bed, you've got no chance. And it doesn't matter if it's cold or a rut phase or whatever. There's just so much hunting pressure in my combat zones that you were asking me about, that's the game we have to play.
Gotcha. All right. So that throw all the other stuff out the window. When there's high hunting pressure, they do one thing, and that's try to survive, basically.
Yeah, and their bedding, safety is their top priority. It supersedes sex with the does. It supersedes food. A safe bedding area overrides that. And a lot of hunters have a hard time understanding that in areas that don't have a lot of high hunting pressure. They think, the buck's going to move over to this food source and bed nearby because that's the preferred food source. Well, in their hunting area, that's what the buck does. But in super high pressure areas, there are only so many beds that a mature buck can get into and not be disturbed by other hunters. And that will be that buck's highest priority.
Gotcha. All right. Very, very, very good information to have if you're a hunter. That's to know the priorities. That's something that I think we overlook. Like, what's this buck's priority in my area? Once you can figure that out, I think it helps you understand where to hunt and when to hunt it.
Yeah, and we'll contrast that with the wilderness hunt that I do in Ontario, where I was successful for a very large buck. Because it's away from my home and I'm making a trip there, I use a completely different style. We don't have the hunting pressure up there.
Right.
If I'm not familiar with the area, I'll identify a half dozen areas on aerials and topos that look like they should hold some mature buck traffic. And so my completely different style when I go up to Ontario or some areas of Michigan's Upper Peninsula in the big woods is I will actually spend the first 2, maybe even 3 days of my week-long hunt going to those spots and doing a recon, never standing on top of the sign or where I expect the buck to come through. The big buck that I shot in Ontario there, it was about the third spot that I'd identified. The other 2 looked okay, but nothing great. Came into the third spot. There's this young clear cut with a lot of doe bedding. It falls off the face of a bluff down to a creek bottom with some beaver ponds and dams. So what I did is I stayed off of those transition trails along the clear cut, went down the bluff in a different area, and approached those ponds and dams. Paralleling it from a distance, you can take optics if you want, but I saw some big fresh rubs, and I could see a couple of big fresh scrapes on the way to that clear cut. So when I ended up spending the first couple of days checking on those 6 different areas, I had really hot sign at that one particular spot. And so I set up immediately to hunt it, and I wasn't even on stand an hour, and that big 9 come walking down toward that clear cut in the does, and I shot him. He dressed well over 200 pounds and was a very nice buck for that area. But that's a completely different hunting style. When you don't have the hunting pressure, we do things differently. Now, the alternative to that, and I see a lot of guys do it in big woods and wilderness areas, is they find some good-looking spots and aerials and topos, and then they just go hunt. I would recommend that you don't do that. I would recommend that you do spot checks of your different areas to see which one's hot. The wilderness deer are a little more forgiving of humans than they are in high-pressure areas, and that's how I set up to hunt.
Gotcha. Excellent advice. Let's transition into one of your most memorable deer hunts. Where are we going to go on this hunt?
We're going to go to Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and I'm chuckling because it's still memorable to this day. And I had located a very mature buck that was spending a lot of time on a deep swamp island. And the only way, I was a lot younger back then, by the way, the only way I could get to that buck was by wearing hip boots and doing an end around. It took me about 2.5 hours to get to my stand. And then once I got there and got set up, the buck that I was after, a very large mature UP buck, picked me off. I had a little backdraft of airflow. And so I was very disappointed to put that much work into it. But he was rubbing on 10-inch diameter trees and very tall rubs, and very, very nice buck. So I waited a little while longer, and I think it was 1:15 in the afternoon. They had another different, very nice 9-point. Decided that where I had set up to cover the front of that remote swamp island is where he wanted to bed. And I could hear him coming in the heavy cover. This was a gun hunt and gun season. I kept watching for him out in front of me. And then I realized that he's standing on this little knoll that I'm watching the island from. And so I very carefully, that's how thick the cover is. You can't see anything. I very carefully swung my head to the left. I'm on the ground. And he and I came face to face. And he exploded out of there. And a lot of times the bucks will make a mistake, whether you're still hunting or they encounter you. About half the time they'll make a mistake. He got out about, probably about 70 yards and stopped to look back because he wasn't sure what had happened. And with my 7 meg, I was standing up at that point. I, stood up and tried to get him in my scope. I could see an eyeball. I could see his throat patch. So I shot him in the throat patch and dropped him right there. But what was so memorable about it, he dressed well over 200 pounds. So I was happy about that, was that it took me over 12 hours to get him out.
Wow. All right.
And that's with a friend.
Wow.
I went back out, made my way. Now, I didn't have to swing around to keep my hunt scent free. I actually just, went down the island and straight out.
Right.
Got my friend, real big guy, full-time fireman, very strong. Drug him back there with me. He was up there. I'd put him on an island and set him up, and I guided him to a buck right away, but that's a different story. He came back and helped me with that buck. And about midnight, we abandoned it because we were just about poking our eyes out in the heavy cover.
Yep.
So one of the things that I do to protect that buck, I didn't have a stream nearby. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll tuck him in the stream under a log jam and tie him in.
Yep.
Keep him cool overnight. But I didn't have that option in this particular case. And understanding the predators that we have in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, I had gutted the deer, and my friend and I had started dragging the long drag out. We decided to give up on it because we were getting our eyes poked out. So we were going to leave it overnight and come back at first light. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I always do is we took our hats off, a couple of socks, got them rubbed up under the arms, put them on top of the buck. And we're really hoping that the predators leave it alone. And typically they will. We came back at first light the next morning and the buck was untouched. I went over to where the gut pile was, and the gut pile was completely gone. And so we started the drag again, and I believe it was 1:30 in the afternoon, the following day when we stepped out onto the little woods road with that buck. So the effort that it took to take that buck and to get that buck out is absolutely one of my most memorable hunts. All of the strength that it took to get that buck out of there and to get all of those predators to leave that gutted buck alone was one of my most memorable hunts.
I can see why. The ones that almost kill you.
And that was. Yeah. It ended up being over 12 hours. Yep.
Yeah. Very, very cool. Excellent story. Thank you for sharing that with us. And I have 10 rapid fire questions for you.
Okay.
I didn't prep you for these, so hopefully you're ready.
Let's give it a try.
Okay. All right. What's your number one hunting tip of all time?
Don't get lost in a big swamp and have me come rescue you.
Good one. All right. What's the one thing that you can't hunt without? These are the things, if you leave it in the truck, it drives you crazy.
Being a swamp hunter, it's my neck compasses. I always have 2 compasses on a lanyard around my neck. Wouldn't go anywhere without them. Battery-powered devices fail.
Good point. They will fail in water. What is your biggest pet peeve in life?
Not having enough time to deer hunt. And
Good one. How old are you today?
I am 53.
You're 53. What would you tell the 25-year-old Scott Shawl, knowing what you know today?
I would tell him to continue to follow in the teachings of your family. Trust more in your friends. I think that's solid advice.
Okay, excellent. You're at a hunting convention somewhere in the world and a stranger comes up to you and you strike up a conversation. They ask you what you do for a living. What do you say?
I tell them that I've been a lifelong paramedic. I started off working on EMS as a state licensed EMT at age 15. At age 18, I became a state licensed paramedic, and I now manage the emergency medical services for a county here in Michigan.
Gotcha. What did you have for breakfast this morning?
Bacon and eggs. How's that for deer hunting fare?
Quintessential traditional American. That's excellent. I love it. All right.
Didn't see that coming though, Jay.
I didn't. Usually it's like I had a health shake or I had something at McDonald's or but
that's not my standard fare. But right. I had some requests from some young household members. So
very nice. Oh, it's good to hear that people are still eating bacon and eggs here and there. Excellent. What? Okay, you get your own billboard on the side of a highway anywhere you want. It's a blank canvas. What would you put on it?
I would put on it, keep your family close and your enemies closer.
I like that one. Very nice. If I say the word successful to you, who's the first person that pops into your head and why?
I would have to say it's an acquaintance of mine who is recently departed this earth. Not only did he do an exemplary job of raising his own children, he was a lifelong first responder, sheriff deputy, and firefighter. And he also, over the course of the years, raised 13 different foster kids. And it's a man that I admire greatly.
Sounds like a heck of a guy. Wow. All right. What's a typical day in the life of Scott Shawl look like?
Typical days, getting up and getting the kids ready for school, getting them to their school, and hustling on over to the Emergency Medical Services Department that I'm the manager of, and preparing for briefings with administrators. Following that, we're talking the baseball practice, cheerleading, soccer, and then once all that's wrapped up, we finally get to come home and do the more traditional things around the household.
Gotcha. All right. Very good. And then finally, what's a typical deer hunting day in your life look like?
A lot of effort. Getting up very early, knowing that I'm going to be bleeding before the day's over from the swamps that I penetrate. But it's something that I actually enjoy, and no one's going to see me until well after dark when I finally make it out.
Gotcha. Very, very cool. Scott, that was the 10 rapid-fire questions. I thought you did really well and answered.
It wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be.
It's a little intimidating in the beginning, but everybody cruises through it, so you did well.
Sure. Thank you.
This has been awesome, man. It's been an absolute pleasure and talking to you. I think you have some really great deer knowledge, and I'm thankful that you decided to share it with everybody that's listening to the show, and it's quite a few people. So I think this will be one of those ones that people will reference frequently because we went so deep into some detail about hunting those swamps that are just so difficult to get into and understand the importance. And I think you touched on some very, very influential and important details along the way. So thank you for doing that.
Good. And it's my privilege, Jay. I appreciate you reaching out and talking to me about all these swamp hunting techniques and methods. It's my honor. Thank you.
How's that for a bag of information?
Oh, man. Loaded full, Jay. Loaded full as always. That's the great thing about the guests that we dig into and find, and man, it's always just loaded full of information, and we hope that everybody puts that to use and utilize what you've learned, and man, take your hunt to the next level.
Yeah, just phenomenal wealth of information about deer hunting, specifically in the swamps. I mean, I think you could probably put these guys anywhere, and they do fairly well. But boy, they key in on those swamps, and they just know it so well. And I'm watching some of Dan's DVD that he sent over, and I'm looking at swamps differently, quite frankly, as I drive by them. I'm starting to look at them as Dan has shown us in some of his videos, and as Scott has described in some of his stuff. I'm hoping that we can go live with Scott like we did with Dan and Sam and all the other people that we've gone live with, because I'm really enjoying those live segments.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Dusty, do we have a Chubby Tines tip of the week this week?
Yeah, we do. And
the Chubby Tines tip of the week is sponsored by Morse's Sporting Goods. Firearms, used bows, located at 85 Kentucky Falls Road in Hillsborough, New Hampshire. Give Jim a call at 603-464-3444, morsessportinggoods.com. Your dollars go further in New Hampshire. There's no sales tax. Morse's Sporting Goods.
With Culver joined on, it's time to talk a little bit about cameras and what you want to do with your cameras. And I tell you what, if you're not using trail cameras, you need to be. It educates you on what you deer do in the off season, and by understanding what their movement is now will play a huge role in up and coming months of whitetail deer hunting. You can focus on where they're pulling their most nutrition from as far as food source, where they're traveling to, where they're bedding at. And right now you can really get into an area and set up a few cameras and let it ride for a month or two. Most cameras now take 8 AA batteries, and man, they can really last for, you can put a 32 gig card in particularly, and really last for a long time in there and take a lot of pictures. And it's almost like your Scout. Right now is the time to skin your Scout in, to check out what you got coming far as contenders or players in the fall. So take advantage of right now to get out there and get them trail cameras up. The weather's starting to change. The battery life's going to be better. So use the spring here. Get your cameras out. Put them in places you normally wouldn't, and start monitoring your deer herd.
I think that's a great tip. And those coverts, man, I don't think I changed the batteries in my camera all winter. We had a slightly warmer February, but a lot of snow in February, and I think we had a overall very cold December and January. I still haven't changed the batteries from last year. That's crazy to me.
Yeah, for sure. And that's something that batteries are not cheap, and I'm not saying that I'm cheap, but man, I like to see something that gets a good life out of what I've purchased to put in it and use it for.
Yep, exactly. I hate to spend money when there's a technology that can help me just, not use as much energy. So.
Right. So yeah, you get a chance. You're looking for a camera. Mm-hmm. Go to www.dlccovertscoutingcameras.com and purchase your camera and let them know Big Buck Registry sent you over to pick them up.
Well, awesome. Thank you, sir, for coming up with another Chubby Times tip of the week. Man, it's been another fantastic show. I'm really loving this live stuff. The harness program definitely needs some more harnesses, and looking forward to coming back next week. But between now and then, Dusty, when we're not chomping it up here in the podcast studios on our microphones, where can we reach out to you?
Shoot me an email, dusty@bigbuckregistry.com. You can also look me up on Facebook, Chubby Times Outdoors, and at Chasing Antler on Instagram or Twitter. And boy, if you send me an email or a message on Facebook, Jay, where can people reach out to you when you're on the mic?
Gotcha, man. Best place is jay@bigbuckregistry.com. That's my email address. You can always give us a call at 724-613-2825. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and iTunes. And all those are as follows: bigbuckregistry.com/Facebook, bigbuckregistry.com/Twitter, bigbuckregistry.com/Instagram, bigbuckregistry.com/YouTube, and bigbuckregistry.com/iTunes. If you happen to not be an iTunes user, you can actually download our app, which is bigbuckregistry.com/app or GApp, depending upon what kind of phone you have. And you can also find us on Stitcher and Blueberry and TuneIn Radio, and also now on iHeartRadio. So we're pretty much got the gamut covered there. And if you can't find us on any of those because you don't have access to any of those, you can actually just go to our website, bigbuckregistry.com, and find us right there. I think that is where we're hanging out, my friend.
I'm Dusty Phillips.
I'm Jay Scott.
And this is another great episode of the Big Buck Registry Deer Hunting Podcast. We'll see you next week.
Can't wait.